What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking our favorite Week 2 NFL DFS picks that you must know this weekend. So make sure to tune in. If you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there. And let us hear it in the comment section. Do you agree, disagree, along with any other questions you guys might have? We will do our best to answer them all. But with that being said, let's get right into it. And today, we're going to be doing our breakdown featuring PrizePicks, our DFS site of choice, where in fact, if you sign up today using code ADP, you will get a 100% deposit match up to $100. So take advantage of that now. Link is in the description. But if you guys aren't familiar with PrizePicks, it's super simple, super easy, and fun to use. Basically, you can combine any string of sports that you want. It doesn't have to be just the NFL, and make those selections with any type of player prop bets. As you can see for the NFL, we've got single stat DFS or fantasy score. So you can go into single stat DFS. You can look at pass yards, rush yards, receiving yards, receptions, everything you see here. Or if you just want to focus on fantasy scores, you can do that as well. But, the general rules, again, really simple and really fun. All you have to do is choose 2 or more players from the big board and then just pick their over-under on the projected fantasy score or on the single stat overall. And that's really it. From there, based on how you want to approach your selections, you can be a little bit more conservative via flex play or a little bit more, aggressive with a power play where you have to get all your picks correct to win. While the flex play, you can miss one and still win. So it is the safer option, but we'll go through that as we break these picks down, where in fact today we're going to be looking at our favorite top 10 Week 2 NFL DFS picks. So let's get right into it. And today we're actually going to be focusing on the fantasy score section specifically. And I want to kick it off here with one Elijah Mitchell of the San Francisco 49ers running back. You can see that his over-under for fantasy score is set at 12.5 points. Now, this is based on full PPR scoring. Keep that in mind. Now, the way I'm approaching this with Elijah Mitchell's fantasy score, yes, I get it. He was the breakout darling of Week 1 where Sermon was inactive, where Raheem Mostert got hurt, and the 49ers played the Detroit Lions. Let's not forget that. So now everybody and their grandmother is all in on Elijah Mitchell. But a couple things to consider here. First and foremost, Trey Sermon is going to be active this week. The 49ers staff has confirmed that. So that immediately brings somebody else, to this backfield who was in fact drafted ahead of Elijah Mitchell. So I don't think that people saying that Mitchell is going to be the number 1 running back for the 49ers is a foregone conclusion. On top of that, this matchup versus the Eagles should be a little bit tougher than what we saw versus that Lions defense. And with Kyle Shanahan, the way he approaches his running back usage, it's so unpredictable. It's usually a committee approach, hot hand approach. So there's no guarantee that Mitchell is going to be the guy yet again. For all of those reasons, I would be looking at the under for those 12.5 points with Mitchell. But let's continue on here, and I want to specifically look at James Robinson next. So with James Robinson, what you're going to notice is that his fantasy score is put at 11.5 points. And if you watched the Jaguars in Week 1 versus the Texans, a much easier matchup, man, to some extent, that tells you all you need to know because the usage for Robinson was absolutely atrocious. I said the one thing that would stop James Robinson last week would be Urban Meyer and how he utilizes him. And guess what? That's exactly what happened because James Robinson really for the first half didn't have any carries. In fact, Carlos Hyde got carries ahead of James Robinson. Now, this is going to be a much tougher matchup where the Jaguars, if they find themselves down early like they did versus the Texans, which is a very real possibility because their defense stinks, then they're going to have to abandon the run altogether. James Robinson is splitting carries inexplicably with Carlos Hyde. Urban Meyer has no idea what he's doing. I am fading James Robinson. I will take the under on that 11.5. Just like the under on the Elijah Mitchell here. And as you can see, as soon as you select those, you can then afterwards specify whether your payout is going to be done via flex play or power play, like we mentioned before. So pretty simple there, but let's continue onward because there are a couple more guys that I want to mention here, obviously. Next up, we've got Adam Trautman of the New Orleans Saints. Now, a thing to keep in mind with the Saints is, yes, they're coming off an absolutely amazing game versus the Green Bay Packers, where Jameis Winston was on fire. Everybody was getting touchdowns. But Trautman, he did benefit from that as well. However, he's not the only tight end that's being utilized in this offense. And I don't think that Jameis Winston is going to be able to be as efficient as he was in week 1, where in fact he had 15 passes and 5 of those were touchdowns. That's an absolutely incredible clip. Versus the Panthers, I think we're going to see more classic Jameis Winston where he's getting guys like Marquez Callaway, Deontay Harris involved, Alvin Kamara. So honestly, I'm fading Adam Trautman. In order for him to hit that 8 fantasy score mark, he's going to have to get a touchdown, in my opinion. The volume isn't all that high. So I'm actually fading Trautman here on the week. I'm looking at the under as far as fantasy points are concerned. But continuing onward here, Andy Dalton of the Chicago Bears, 16 fantasy points. I am absolutely hammering the over for Andy Dalton because the fact of the matter is, yes, Dalton is not the answer long-term for the Chicago Bears. And Justin Fields should probably be starting sooner rather than later. But guess what? The Cincinnati Bengals are a completely different opponent from the LA Rams, who the Bears faced last week. Defensively, they are a cakewalk compared to the Rams. This is the Andy Dalton revenge game versus the Bengals technically, but I'm not really taking that into consideration. I'm just taking into consideration that 16 fantasy points for a quarterback ain't all that high. And, the Bengals defense, they're going to have their hands full with Allen Robinson, David Montgomery, Darnell Mooney. Dalton knows the Bengals. I think he's going to be able to take advantage of this matchup, and I am going to be taking the over on the 16 fantasy points without even questioning in it. So let's continue to move on here. Next up, I want to talk one Josh Jacobs, who his fantasy score over under is set at 12 points. And here I'm looking at the under once again, because if you guys remember in week 1, yes, Jacobs had 2 touchdowns, close to like 20 fantasy points versus the Ravens, but he did that on 34, about 40 yards rushing. That's absolutely insane. That's, again, just incredible efficiency in Jacobs getting those short yardage touchdowns. Now, take into account that Jacobs is a little bit banged up. He's not utilized as the pass-catching running back. That's Kenyon Drake. And on top of that, now you face the Pittsburgh Steelers, one of the toughest defenses in the NFL, who just shut down Josh Allen and the Bills, one of the darlings of 2021, and a team that a lot of people were picking to go to the Super Bowl after what Josh Allen did last year in, an MVP type of performance. So I think this is going to be a completely different game script. I think Jacobs is clearly not 100%. He is a liability as a pass catcher, and it's a tougher matchup. So I will be taking the under on the 12 fantasy score mark. Continuing to look at this game between the Raiders and the Steelers, I want to look at Henry Ruggs next, because I think the fact that he has 8.5 fantasy score as his line is absolutely nuts. I haven't seen anything from Ruggs that would suggest that, he warrants that type of credit, because versus the Ravens last week, which again was an easier matchup, Ruggs at one point was being outpaced by the fullback for the Raiders. And I think right now there's a clear kind of hierarchy for the Raiders. It goes Darren Waller, Darren Waller, Darren Waller. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, probably then Bryan Edwards, then Kenyon Drake, and then maybe Henry Ruggs. Henry Ruggs is purely like a home run hitter versus this Pittsburgh defense. They don't allow those big type of plays. So I'm fading that 8.5 fantasy mark. I think this is going to be a much lower scoring type of game. I don't think that's going to be advantageous for the type of, player that Henry Ruggs is. So I will be fading him here. Moving on, I want to look at Mac Jones, who had a pretty good outing in week 1 versus the Dolphins. Probably should have won if it wasn't for a Damian Harris fumble. But other than that, Mac Jones, hey, he played very, very well. Now, his over-under mark in fantasy is set at 17.5 points. I think that's just being very disrespectful. I get it. He's a rookie, but he's going up against the Jets, who looked absolutely awful. Absolutely awful in week 1. And I get it. It's only week 1, but there's no reason to think why, at least in the short term, they're going to get better, especially defensively. They just look like a team that has trouble everywhere. And I think Mac Jones can pick this defense apart. He looked smart. He looked calculated in week 1. He's got enough weapons, a good offensive line. I think Mac Jones is easily going to get over that 17.5 total, and I think the Patriots are absolutely going to wax the New York Jets. So for that reason, well, I am taking the over on the fantasy points for Mac Jones. Now, let's continue onward here, and I want to shift focus to the game between the Atlanta Falcons and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And specifically here, let's start looking at Mike Davis, where his fantasy total is set at 12.5 points. And honestly, I think that's a little bit too high. Remember what I said last week about Ezekiel Elliott? I wasn't touching him with a 10-foot pole versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They have got one of the best rush defenses, if not best rush defenses in the NFL. And if I was cautious about Ezekiel Elliott, you better sure as hell believe I'm cautious about Mike Davis. The Falcons, on top of that, looked absolutely atrocious in week 1 versus an easier opponent in the Philadelphia Eagles. I think Mike Davis is going to be an absolute non-factor in terms of rushing yards. The only potential salvation here is, from a PPR aspect, that Mike Davis gets several dump-off passes. But even if that happens, I don't think it's going to accumulate into a lot of yards. I anticipate Calvin Ridley, Kyle Pitts, hopefully Russell Gage to kind of have a bounce-back performance. But I just don't see Mike Davis being a factor here. If the Bucs were able to shut down Ezekiel Elliott, I think they can do the same for Mike Davis. So for that reason, I am fading Davis this week. Now, continuing on, I want to look at a quarterback here in Kyler Murray, 24.5 fantasy points. Yes, that is a pretty hefty mark. But when it comes to Kyler Murray, I said this during, the offseason. He was my pick to be the 2021 NFL MVP. He sure as hell looked that week 1, where he absolutely destroyed the Titans, passing all over them, running all over them. And that's the exciting thing about Kyler Murray. In my opinion, he is the most efficient dual threat quarterback, the most complete dual threat quarterback, because he's so dangerous with his arm as well. And the Minnesota Vikings, that matchup, well, the Vikings didn't look all that impressive in week 1. And I think that Murray can have success against them. I think, again, he can get it done with his legs. He can get it done with his arms, to Hopkins, to Christian Kirk, to Moore, to AJ Green. A lot of different options. So I really like Kenyon Drake here. I think this will be another high-scoring game. And to me, I think Kyler Murray is going to be in the conversation for a top 2, top 3 fantasy football type of quarterback every single week. And that usually translates to at least high 20s in terms of fantasy points. But now let's look at our last pick on the week. I'm specifically looking at Austin Ekeler of the LA Chargers, who I said it in week 1. Yes, he had a very tough matchup versus the Washington football team. So I was probably going to stay away from it. But now versus the Dallas Cowboys, boy, oh boy, give me all of Austin Ekeler. His point total set at 17 points. I'm hammering the over, where even in week 1, he was able to get a touchdown and still have a pretty decent day versus Washington. This Dallas defense, you saw how bad they were versus the Bucs. Now they're more banged up. Injuries, to that defensive line. That's going to benefit Ekeler to such a huge degree. I think this is going to be a high-scoring affair. We saw it with the Dallas Cowboys. That's still the case for them. Dak Prescott just throwing the ball everywhere, and that's going to lend itself to, again, probably a lot of shootouts, a lot of back-and-forth offensive performances, and the Chargers definitely have the personnel to back it up. I think everybody on the Chargers offensively, Herbert, Keenan Allen, Austin Ekeler, Mike Williams, are all going to have huge days. But going up versus this Dallas defense that's banged up, to me, Ekeler is the guy that I most want to focus on. Again, he's going to get much more targets than he did in the passing game in week 1 here. That's going to contribute to him in PPR especially, which is the case here. Red zone, he got the looks there as well. So I think that Austin Ekeler is a great option for fantasy football running backs this week. I think he can absolutely be a top 5 guy versus the Dallas Cowboys. So I am hammering the over. But with that, we wrap up our top 10 favorite week 2 NFL DFS picks. And as usual, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree, along with any other questions you guys might have? If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there, and make sure to check out PrizePicks for a ton of other DFS picks. But in the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.